여러분 안녕하십니까? 서울대 인공지능 정책 이니시티브가 주최하는 AI와 시장 컨퍼런스에 오신 것을 환영합니다. 저는 이니시티브의 공동 디렉터를 맡고 있는 서울대 로스쿨의 임용 교수입니다. 오늘 세션은 웨비나 시리즈로 진행하고 있는 2020 인공지능 정책 국제 컨퍼런스의 6번째 세션입니다. 법률가를 위한 아시모프라는 제목으로 인공지능 규제에 관하여 EUI의 니콜라이 푸티 교수님께서 발표를 해주실 예정입니다. 사인 니콜라스 푸티 교수님을 간략하게 소개해드리겠습니다. 푸티 교수님은 European University Institute와 Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies의 경쟁법 분야 석좌 교수십니다. 많은 분들이 푸티 교수님을 EU 경쟁법 분야의 전문가로 알고 계시고 실제로 벨기에 경쟁 당국의 판사 그리고 로펌에서 재직한 실무 경험도 있으시고 활발히 연구와 저술을 하고 계시는 유럽의 대표적인 경쟁법 학자 중에 하나입니다. 그런데 인공지능과 관련해서도 EU 인공지능 고위 전문가 그룹의 위원으로 2007년부터 활동해 오셨고 연구를 활발히 하고 계십니다. 오늘 법률가를 위한 아시모프라는 흥미로운 토픽으로 여러분과 말씀을 나눌 예정인데 바로 교수님의 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sang-Yoon, and hello, everybody. I want to start by thanking the organizers of SAPI and to say that I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak today at the AI Policy Conference. I have to say that I feel I have a special bond with Korea. As I explained to Sang-Yoon earlier this week, since I'm a kid, I have had the chance to meet Korean people at the apartment of my parents in Paris, my mother being a professor of French, and for some reason my mother for a very long time has educated young Koreans, sons of expatriates in Paris to learn French and English. And so these bonds really came even more true a few years ago when I had the opportunity to come to Seoul on 2 occasions and to meet the people of South Korea in the country. And this was a marvelous experience. I hope there will be others in the future, and this is why I should not disappoint today. So my talk is called Models of Regulation and Law for AI and What to Learn or Not from Science Fiction. Next slide, please. The talk is based on a paper that will appear in the Routledge Social Science Handbook of Artificial Intelligence, but also on forthcoming work with my former assistants about the relationship between science fiction literature and artificial intelligence. The ambition in the talk is to try to make sense of the proliferation of legislative and regulatory interventions towards AI that we see all across the world, and in particular, as far as I'm concerned, in Europe. There have been many new legislative, regulatory, or quasi-regulatory developments in Europe. The European Commission adopted a white paper. The high-level expert group close to the European Commission adopted guidelines on ethics and investments in AI. The Council of Europe has launched a feasibility study on the adoption of new law for AI. So there is a lot going on around us today. So to discuss that and what science fiction, ultimately this is the related goal of the talk, may tell us about these initiatives, I will proceed in 6 steps that you can see on the slides, and I will start with a quick reminder of what artificial intelligence is, but I'm sure you know that all too well. Next slide, please. So AI is a field of computer science. It's based on an old idea, the idea that any physical process, including the mind process, can be modelized as a computable algorithm. It's called the Church-Turing hypothesis. And therefore, one idea that a software at some point or the other might be able to reproduce the mind process, at least in outcomes, and emulate human intelligence. An additional point is that we know today that machines, AI systems, can learn and improve their performance from experience. So much like the minds, the human mind, much like human intelligence, machines tend to do things which look pretty close. For several decades, AI has gone through cycles, winters and summers, and enthusiasm was followed by disappointment, and the cycles just kept repeating. Recently, say, since maybe 15 years, there has been increased enthusiasm about AI due to the availability of large amounts of computational power. This is the kicking in of Moore's law. Also, the emergence of the distributed internet has made available really gazillions of data, has led to the production of the digitalization of knowledge to a scale which was unprecedented. And that also has allowed to train AI machines better. And last but not least, a lot of scientists have seemed to accept what some people call the end of theory, which is the idea that you don't need to be able to explain everything that an AI system provides in terms of outcomes to consider it's valid. Often, indeed, AI systems operate processes that we only imperfectly understand. Deep learning, neural networks, and so on creates a sort of black box problem. But it doesn't matter because the results seem pretty efficient. So now we are seeing a lot of areas in which AI systems can and start to be deployed. Self-driving vehicles is one area in which we place a lot of hopes, but also predictive justice, automated law enforcement, and other the healthcare sector and the education sector are potential use cases. So if one tries to make sense of the various models of law and regulation that we see emerge, one can really distinguish, and I've been really thinking hard about that, 4 types of models of law and regulation, and I want to say a few words about each of them. So the first model that seems to arise is what I call the black letter law model. Under the black letter law model, the question that people ask is, how do existing laws apply to an AI system? So the black letter law approach starts from the identification of the relevant source of law to which it confronts a matter of fact involving an AI system. In practice, the matter of fact will often be an AI use case leading to a dispute between 2 or more individuals or organizations. So people that work under the black, and sometimes implicitly under the black letter law approach, very often conduct their analysis within a specific field of the law. For instance, they consider liability, consumer protection, intellectual property, labor law, privacy, or civil liability. So one clear example of an issue that is often treated under a black letter law approach consists in asking whether AI-created inventions can benefit from intellectual property protection? And if this is the case, who is the owner of intellectual property? Consider an AI-created song. Under copyright law across the world, courts and legislation insists that a work potentially subject to copyright protection must exhibit a degree of creativity, which reflects the author's intellectual creation and which constitutes the exercise of a non-mechanical, non-trivial skill and judgment. A debate today exists whether AI machines display enough of these requirements to be entitled to copyright protection as owners or creators. Okay. Now, the black letter law approach is often based and often dominated by questions about the objectives or the goal of the law. To solve the frictional cases that I mentioned, courts and lawmakers often need to return to the origins of the statutes and ask themselves, what did we try to do by adopting legislation? So in the context of legal personhood granted to corporations, for instance, one of the points of the lawmakers when adopting legal personhood for corporations was to promote economic exchange. Okay, so the question would be then, under the black letter law approach, in terms of AI legal personhood, should we grant legal personhood to AI in the prospect that this will promote economic exchange? Okay, so this is the kind of question that people ask when they place themselves implicitly or explicitly under the black letter law approach. The second approach, or the second model of law and regulation of AI that you can use to sort of think about what people are doing when they are legislating, is what I call the emergent model. So the emergent model is different in its operation. The emergent model asks whether AI systems create new issues which require the creation of new branches of the law. The assumption in the emergent approach, often implicit again, is that AI systems produce emergent phenomena. Concretely, people that discuss under the emergent model tend to consider that AI creates unique and new economic, ethical, and scientific concerns, and therefore that new legislation is needed. An emergent model is often at work behind books, articles, and commentaries on the law of driverless cars, or the law of drones, or the law of robots. So under the emergent model, what is interesting is that we find some discrepancies with the black letter law model. Some issues which were not really discussed within the black letter law model with its silos of legal disciplines become more prominent in the emergent phenomena approach. This is the case of the legal arrangements, for instance, governing certification, taxation, and politics. In the emergent model, legal issues are framed as general topics that cut across various disciplines of the law. For instance, innovation policy is the umbrella framework under which people discuss liability, freedom of speech, and intellectual property. So interestingly, the emergent phenomena approach, by contrast to the black letter law approach, is more normative in terms of the content of the discussion that is conducted. Experts discuss questions like, should the law, more than questions about, does the law? Should the law apply to this AI system and under what conditions, rather than does the law apply to this AI system and how? Okay, so the emergent model is clearly one approach which is often discussed by technologists, people without a legal background, because they focus on the technology and they ask, what's needed. Whereas the black letter law model is often the one that's discussed by people with legal education or legal expertise, and they jump immediately to thinking about the law. The third model of law and regulation of AI is what I call the ethical model. Again, all these models are not explicit in the legal and regulatory initiatives that one sees. I have to recall that. But if you read them, you will find elements of one or two or more of these approaches in the text that you will be going through. So the ethical model is slightly different. The ethical model considers that any law and regulation of AI should have a strong ethical component. Ethics are a fundamental component of how and why to regulate AI. So ethics is the part of practical philosophy that deals with moral issues, and ethics is often defined as a shorthand as what distinguishes the good from the bad. It provides norms that allow to tell us whether something is good or something is bad. Normative ethics, which is the branch that we're looking at here, has several branches: virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialism. I'll just say a word about them because all of them at some distinct levels tend to infuse the discussion on AI law and regulation. So virtue ethics, to start, considers that the good, that happiness, requires the practice of moral qualities in daily life. Aristotle singled out wisdom, justice, intelligence, and moderation. In an AI context, virtue ethics can be exemplified by the requirement of transparency. Transparency would be the moral virtue of an AI system. Deontological ethics is slightly different. Deontological ethics considers that compliance with certain duties, certain commands, certain obligations determine whether an action is right or wrong, regardless of its consequences. For instance, assistance to homeless people is always right, regardless of its consequences, whether it impoverishes the person who assists or the person who is assisted by not providing the right amount of incentives. So the philosopher Kant identified a number of categorical imperatives that have to be complied with to be deontologically ethical and therefore good. And to some extent, some instruments in Europe embrace this Kantian ethical spirits when they state, for instance, that AI is not an end in itself. What is the end is increasing human flourishing. Okay, so the third version of the ethical model is consequentialism. This is even more easy. What distinguishes the good from the bad depends on cost-benefit analysis. Right? It depends on impacts, harms versus opportunities. And so what really matters in consequentialism is to assess whether an AI system will produce more harm than good. If it produces more harm than good, then the AI system is bad. If it produces more good than harm, the AI system is good. Now, the ethical model of law and regulation of AI is technology neutral. This is not a model that is specific to AI. It was previously deployed, it was previously applied, it was previously implemented in relation to other technology like biological cell manipulation and works on the genome, for instance, and work on cell reproduction, right? So in AI, it has a bunch of specificities, but you can see that the same principles, a lot of the principles that we discuss in AI ethics relates very closely to the principle that we applied in bioethics, okay? So these are the sort of four streams of approaches that influence the shaping of the law and regulation of AI. People come to the question with a black letter approach. People come to the question with an emergent approach. People come to the question with a ethical approach. People come to the question, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention the last one, the risk regulation one, which is extremely important, of course. So that is the fourth model. And the risk regulation model, it's quite close to consequentialism with a significant difference. So risk regulation tries to reduce the probability of occurrence or the levels of harms arising from technological events. Okay, so I repeat, risk regulation means attempts to reduce the probability of occurrence or the level of harms arising from technological events. So in the white paper on AI, the European Commission has taken a clear risk regulation approach when it has said that a regulatory framework should concentrate on how to minimize the various risks of potential harm. So the risk regulation model has several features which are important. First, it's preventive. It's not corrective. And this is a distinction with consequentialism, which often tolerates a corrective approach because a corrective approach is less costly than a preventive approach, okay? So to be very concrete, a risk regulation approach in AI means red buttons on AI applications and human in the loop. So these are the types of product safety design requirements that pertain to a risk regulation spirit. The second really important feature of the risk regulation model is that it is based on statistical evidence to mitigate risk. So in other words, there is a key scientific component or evidence-based component to risk regulation. Okay, not all risks deserve the same regulatory response. Now, this principle of statistical connection or of evidence-based method finds one important limitation. When calculation is impossible due to scientific uncertainty, risk regulation often moves into something that we call the precautionary principle or precautionary approach. Because absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. An event with an uncertain probability that you cannot compute, but with potentially unsustainable consequences is unacceptable. And this is where the precautionary principle, which is an extreme variant of risk regulation, comes into play. This inspires, in the AI field, calls for bans, moratoriums, or red lines against lethal autonomous weapons, robot warriors, if you prefer, citizen scoring, what we see in some regions in China, or facial recognition technology. Okay, So this is one key difference again with or one key limitation to the scientifically to the evidence-based and calculation-based nature of risk regulation. Okay, now next slide, please. So these four approaches have some shortcomings, and they have some weaknesses. And in the paper that I mentioned earlier, I tried to explore some of them. Again, the paper is not a paper of mathematical precision and extreme empirical veracity. I try to diagnose some issues which are more or less present, or which might one day materialize, even though I cannot provide absolute evidence that this is always the case with these models. Okay, so one of the first problems that we encounter with some models of law and regulation is what I call the paradox of irrelevant law. And the paradox of irrelevant law mostly concerns the black letter law approach. So here what you see that lawyers essentially with imperfect technological background conjecture frictional yet unrealistic use cases or problems in the future problems in the legal system. And sometimes lawyers, because they cannot really think about potential disputes or potential frictions in the future, they resort to science fiction to assist the generation of scenarios of legal disputes that will allow them to improve the law and regulation that exists. So to take one example, think about cars. The dominant hypothesis in science fiction prior to 2000 was one in which by 2015, 2020, men and women would drive flying cars, not driverless cars. And so if we had at the time listened to lawyers conjecturing and proposing new legislation, we would today have a very detailed law of flying cars, but we would have no prepared law for driverless cars. Okay, so this is one example of what I call the problem or the paradox of irrelevant law. A second problem that one can see with these models of law and regulation is the problem of redundant law. And this is, and I can see that in the chat, this is a problem that has been famously called by Judge Easterbrook the problem of the law of the horse. So a fundamental aspect of the emergent model of law, but also maybe of risk regulation, is to treat the technology as novel, unique, very special, and to assume the existence of unique, novel, and very special future challenges. So when Judge Easterbrook talked about the law of the horse, he basically mocked the tendency of certain observers to be willing to adopt new law as soon as a new technology occurs, and to discount the relevance of existing laws to tackle the problems that will be met. Now, the problem of redundant law is exactly that. Assume that an AI-assisted robot gardener causes a damage when mowing the lawn. Do we need to legislate specific rules on robot gardeners to address liability issues? The answer is a sure no. We don't face a new thing, but we face an old problem in a new way. Okay, so I could dwell a long time on that, but in AI, what's important to understand is that AI is imitative in nature. And therefore, as AI systems become more perfect and imitate human behavior, the degree of redundancy with the laws that govern human behavior might increase dramatically. And so we may experience a problem of redundant law for AI systems, at least in outcomes, tend to emulate human outcomes, which are already governed in legal instruments. A third problem with law and regulation models is what I call the failure of good intentions. This is a problem that's mostly relevant for ethical approaches to law and regulation. Ethical rules are quite uncontroversial in their ambitions, the good and the bad, helping promote the good, helping undermine the bad. But it's rife with problems in terms of its practical implications. One first set of problems is known as ethics lobbying or ethics washing. And the idea here is that organizations, private and public, use ethics to prevent, delay, or replace regulation. And one of these examples has been discussed in the EU, where the high-level expert group on AI, of which I was a member, has been attacked for putting too much emphasis on ethics and in a way making the discussion of adjustments to the legal system irrelevant or let's say less urgent. Okay, another problem with ethics, another failure of good intentions, if you will, is the problem, and I think this is a more serious problem, the problem of relativism. There is no universal ethics. There is no single ethics. There is no one that can tell whether it's better to use virtue ethics or deontological ethics or consequentialism. There's no way to rank them. And the trolley problem, so some dispute the relevance of the trolley problem for AI systems, but the trolley problem showed that very neatly. So if you take a self-driving car, you place it in a situation in which there will be inevitable casualties. For example, the self-driving car can continue its lawful course and kill a mother and a baby who crossed on red. The other option is to change course and kill an old woman on the sideway who did nothing wrong. How should the programmers of the self-driving car decide between these two scenarios? Under the consequentialist approach, the car should spare the young baby and the mother, even though they did something wrong. Under the deontological approach, the car should kill the mother and the baby and spare the law compliance, the law obedience, the law abiding citizen on the sideway. And so it's very hard to decide what to do in such scenarios. And the problem of relativism is clearly today a huge issue, even more importantly, because different countries, different regions in the world have very legitimate differences in terms of what they consider ethical and not. Okay, the last problem that one might see arise, and in particular under the model of risk regulation, is what people call knee-jerk regulation. Knee-jerk regulation means an unwarranted application, an extreme application of the precautionary principle in response to realized risks and popular outcry. So the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan provides a possible example. I'm not saying that the disaster, that it was wrong to regulate after the disaster, but I'll explain in a minute what I have in mind. So the Fukushima disaster combines a terminal risk, radioactivity, an intervening event, the earthquake itself, and a reaction of stigmatization by the population across the globe. Now, in several Western countries, including in Europe, some people have blamed nuclear technology and not Japan's exposition to seismic or volcanic or natural hazard as the main cause of problem. And as a result, some countries have decided to exit from nuclear energy and turn to fossil fuels for an alternative. Now, clearly, it's easy to see here an example of knee-jerk regulation. If you had to transpose that to the AI debate, you can consider the case of a deficient AI airliner autopilot. That is a plane that would be very autonomous and governed by AI algorithms. It can be anticipated that society, which is less tolerant to crashes by machines than crashes caused by human errors, would immediately ask companies to suspend any use of automated technology within aircrafts, even though today we use them at a very large scale in airline transportation. So again, this is a kind of reaction that is not necessarily warranted. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've seen the various ways that people think about when they come to the law and regulation of AI, these are the four models. Now that we have seen the various problems that might arise by applying one or the other method, I want to say a word about a related question, a related normative question, which very often infuses the discussion of law and regulation of AI. And the question is law versus public policy for AI. Or to put things maybe more clearly, the question really is about whether technological evolution can be addressed by the existing justice system under applicable legislation. This is very close to the black letter law model, or whether technological evolution requires developing public policy and in turn new legislation to regulate it. So the question is really the question of law creation. Should we, a bit like in what Easterbrook talked about when he talked about the law of the horse, so one of the dominant themes in legal scholarship around AI is, should we rely on the existing justice system and legislative apparatus and doctrinal apparatus, or should we have a policy-oriented discussion with initiatives by policymakers leading to new laws, right? So this question has, of course, no obvious answer, and I'm certainly not here to give you one. But if we frame the question this way, we can find arguments against public policy for AI, and we can find good arguments against applying existing law to AI, okay? The arguments against public policy for AI are essentially three arguments. The first one is that regulation stifles innovation, okay? The phenomenon is very well documented in the literature. If you think about AI systems, for instance, the requirements of data minimization that we see in several instruments like the GDPR in Europe is one which might actually reduce the performance of AI systems in the long term. Another problem of regulation is that interest groups are well placed to capture regulation and design it in ways which improve their benefits at the expense of the public interest. Okay, so for instance, if you think about self-driving cars, the risk of regulatory capture arises if we adopt new legislation from the car insurance sector, right? Which indeed, might be tempted to tweak the legislation to actually maintain systems of mandatory insurance of a driver and owner of vehicles, even though the risk of accidents has decreased dramatically. Okay. A third problem against regulation and a third argument against public policy and regulation is that the exercise is vain. There's nothing to do because technology moves too fast. So this problem is known as the Coleridge dilemma, which means that regulators need to wait until the technology is enough mature to find and to adopt, to shape appropriate regulation. But at the same time, if they wait for too long, the technology is already there and nothing can be done to reverse it. Okay, so these are the sort of three important arguments that are often made to question and criticize law and regulation for AI. Now, there are equally good arguments against just sticking to the system that we have in relation to AI systems. And I won't be too long on that, but I want to say just a few words. So it is often explained in the literature that the existing system, which would solve issues by basically litigation and disputes within the before the courts, is a real disincentive to innovation. Okay, the prospects of litigation chill research and technological development, and it is extremely important to adopt regulation. So that's what people say: adopt regulation preemptively to send the right signals to innovators and inventors that they will not be subject to liability, and that they will be subject to a body of rules which is sufficiently certain and developed ex ante. Other scholars insist on the potential of regulation to improve innovation, to enable innovation. This is the right concept. This is a concept that's used. And the idea here is that properly designed regulation might actually promote innovation by setting ambitious targets for innovation. And so, for instance, in terms of ethics, a lot of people say, okay, if we had new regulation imposing ethical requirements, that would promote innovation towards more ethical standards. Okay, well, okay. So next slide, please. So in the paper, I don't want to talk too much about that because that's again something that I wrote on paper, and it's my own invention, and maybe it's not the most interesting one. But in the paper, I try to promote a fifth way, if you want, that I believe is more consistent and that intertwines a bunch of the approaches that were mentioned before, in particular consequentialism and risk regulation. And so the point in the framework is to distinguish between discrete, systemic, and discrete externalities, systemic externalities, and what I call externalities, and to index the timing and level of the regulatory response on this consideration. So discrete externalities are, minute, small, micro, personal externalities. So that is arms, essentially, adverse impacts, and that they can be dealt with by the court system and their existing law. Systemic externalities are externalities which are more macro, societal, systemic, that affects wider classes of the population arms, things like technological unemployment, for instance, or systemic-wide, population-wide loss of privacy, for instance. Okay, so these are areas which deserve more ex ante, more legal creation. And of course, the last category, and it's way more sophisticated in the paper, involves what I call externalities. So these are global existential risks which threaten humanity as a whole, or humanity of large, wide classes of the population. Okay, so for instance, an AI system could decide that people who are overweight are not productive enough for the flourishing of humanity, and decide to sort of wipe them out or degrade them in terms of their place in society. Or You could have, problems of, Terminator type of issues, which, with lethal autonomous weapons, which would turn against humanity, considering that humans are an impediment to the fulfillment of their performance function as encoded in the algorithm. And so for these types of issues, we need red lines, we need bans, we need moratoriums, and society is right to approach them with a very high anticipative and precautionary approach. And we don't need too much impact assessments and statistical measurements to decide that we should do something about them. Okay, last slide about sci-fi. If I have 5 more minutes, and I can take 5 more minutes to talk about that. Okay, so why is sci-fi irrelevant? Now, you may recall that when I was talking earlier, I was saying, well, lawyers, they use sci-fi, and this is bad because sci-fi only brings you so far with, wrong ideas and wrong models. It's unrealistic. But not all sci-fi is like that. And I'm in particular a big fan of Isaac Asimov's work. And Isaac Asimov's work has a lot of interesting insights for how to think about the law and regulation of AI systems. The reason why Asimov and sci-fi can provide good ideas about the law and regulation of AI is that sci-fi is essentially about predicting change, and in particular change in human behavior in response to technology. Okay, and so it's not so much about whether there will be flying cars or whether there will be time travel or whether we will be able to use holograms to interact. It's not so much about that. It's more about discussing what's interesting in sci-fi. It's more about trying to understand something that we know empirically, which is how humans behave and how they change when they interface with technology. Okay, and so this is why there is some worth in looking at science fiction. Also, Asimov's work is very interesting in the sense that Asimov was a scientist himself. He had a PhD in chemistry, if I'm not wrong, and he taught, I think, biochemistry at university for a while. So he's someone extremely logical, very evidence-driven, and very rigorous in terms of his reasoning, and you can feel that in his work. Okay, so what do we learn when we go through a bunch of Isaac Asimov's novels and writings? So one, we know that Asimov was looking at technology as essentially neutral, not determinist, as we often hear. So Asimov was not making claims about robots or AIs are great or they're awful and the sky will fall. Asimov was treating technology essentially as neutral. And you can read in his work a sort of equal amounts of optimism and pessimism in terms of how to think about robots. He actually wrote about it and he said, I reject a vision of the world that looks as robots as bad or good. He understood robots and technology essentially as artifacts, like a knife who has a hilt to prevent people from harming themselves, or electrical wiring which is insulated to prevent damage to humans. And so hence Asimov was very conscious of the necessity, because robotics, he was really working on robotics, but he had this idea of intelligent robots, much like AI. He thought about that as essentially artifacts, and as any artifact, they have to be to some extent regulated. They have to be safe for humans, and that's where he comes with these 3 laws of robotics in a novel called Run Around from 1942, in which he says, okay, there should be safety design requirements to avoid that humans are harmed, and these are the 3 laws. Law number 1, do not harm humans. Law number 2, obey humans. Law number 3, protect yourself. The equipment should protect itself. And he added a last one, the Diras law, which basically prescribes that robots should protect humanity and not turn against humans. Okay, so there is this strong idea of technological neutrality. Robots and AIs are as artifacts, and the requirements of design safety obligations. Okay. So in Asimov, there is a sense of inevitability of the law, but what you can also see, there is a sense of fallibility of man-made product design, safety, legal requirements. And you can see that a lot. All the novels are about the fact that the laws dysfunction, they are inconsistent, they give inconsistent orders, and so on and so forth. So often, people will use Asimov as an example that law is needed in relation to AI, but I think the equally important point in Asimov is one whereby we have to understand that any effort to legislate will be subject to imperfections. Law is inherently imperfect, and it dysfunctions in terms of its implications. A third argument or hint that you derive from Isaac Asimov's work is that human intervention is very efficient at correcting errors in man-made law. So there's one character in the novels of Isaac Asimov. She's called Susan Calvin. She's a robot psychologist, and she plays a towering role in redressing problems, in identifying problems by logic, essentially, and solving them. And so that gives us a hope that humans are part of the solution as much as they are part of the problem. And the last one, of course, if that's and that maybe qualifies what I said before, is that robots and AIs display what I would call emergent behavior, and that can be seen in a novel called The Evitable Conflict. This is an interesting novel because in The Evitable Conflict, the world is run by optimizing machines and algorithms which ensure perfect equilibrium between demand and supply of goods, labor, and capital. So there's no problem. Everything is produced. Everything that's produced is consumed, and everything that's consumed is produced. Now, at some point in the novel, what you see that in some regions of the world, the West, the North, the South, there are some shortages. There are some wastes, situations of waste. There are some famines, and there are some situations of unemployment. It cannot work. The machines should actually prevent that from happening. And what we learn is that in the novel is that an anti-machine movement has emerged in some corners of the planet, and Susan Calvin investigates the problem of shortages, the problem of famines and wastes and unemployment. Says, how can this work? And she soon gets to understand the following issue. She realizes that machines which obey to the force law, which is protect humanity, machines have developed this idea that they are indeed essential for humans to persist and subsist in the future. Machines are the best thing that humanity can rely upon to go through ages. And because they don't want to be disconnected by the anti-machines movements, the machines start to fake imperfection to dodge calls and demands of the anti-machines movement to destroy them. So what we see in Asimov is this emergent behavior whereby machines actually adapt and adopt behavior that is emergent to protect themselves and to protect humanity. Voila, that's all I wanted to tell you. That closes my intervention. Please do not hesitate to reach out at my coordinates. My email is on the first slide. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope next time I will be able to see you live in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for that riveting presentation. I think you may have persuaded more than a few to start reading Asimov novels. 그럼 시간이 좀 많이 되긴 했습니다만은 청중의 질문에 대한 답변을 좀 들어보는 시간을 뭐 짧게라도 한 5분, 10분 정도 가지도록 하겠습니다. So Nicolas, we'll spend, if it's okay with you, another 5 to 10 minutes entertaining some questions from the audience. So there are more than a few questions, but let me start off with sort of a reality, which you may have alluded to, where for the public that faces uncertainty and anxiety, and maybe even some misinformation about AI or exaggeration from the press, they tend to sort of react in a way that we should do something, at least in some form. So that's sort of the main public opinion at this time. But at the same time, very few react in the opposite way, saying that we should not do anything, at least for now, and we should wait. So for a public policymaker, there's this public, the majority of the public is demanding that something is to be done. So what is your recommendation, or what is your advice to policymakers that actually face pressure from the public in this manner?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's true that the news cycle is dominated by bad news. Good news don't sell, and new technology is often greeted with a lot of skepticism in the press. That's true for AI. That was true for 3D printing, GMOs, and a lot of other technological evolutions. I think the policy structure has to be responsive to that, of course, because it is part of accountability, but it doesn't have to fall into all the demands that appear in the press. And it's a very delicate exercise for them to discharge. I do believe that a lot of the concerns that are expressed and that are presented as AI specific are not AI specific concerns. So for instance, and this would probably allow us to avoid a bunch of pitfalls that are really easy to avert. So if you think about lethal autonomous weapons, for instance, a lot of countries in the world reject war in and of itself as a deontological imperative. There's no question that a war must be avoided at all costs, right? And so when that is understood, it is certainly much easier to develop a very strong position on issues like, should we manufacture lethal autonomous weapons or not? Now I'm saying that at the same time thinking, it's not an easy thing to do, because as with nuclear warheads, for instance, you don't want to be the only country that takes that position. And because you might end up being dominated in the future. And so hence calls for more international law in that respect. I think the solutions are fairly for that they're fairly obvious, but I think you have to maybe sometimes kick AI out of the picture and say, okay, we have an issue here, which is the costs of war and the risks of war are going to increase. It can be called AI or not. Do we want that? We don't want it. And so one way to sort of make the exercise more dispassionate is to kick out AI of the picture and think about the problem. The problem is war, or the problem is democracy. And when you put too much emphasis on AI or the technology, you risk basically disabling the entire technology, right? And so I think that's why the focus of the narrative should be more on, not on technology, but on the really policy issue. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Thank you. So the next question, Nicolas, talks about some of the modes that you of law and regulation that you mentioned. So there was a question where can the paradox of irrelevant law be avoided by creating law that is more flexible? An example was perhaps something similar to a common law approach in the US, for example. Could you sort of tie that to your alternative model and maybe explain in relation to what you are advocating?
Yeah, so my approach is more empirical, in the sense that with the exception of existential risks, which can be addressed without strong empirical knowledge, right? So that would be lethal autonomous weapons, for instance. We just don't want war, okay? And we can define, I think we can define a subset of risks that we want to avoid at all costs, right? And we can put them in a box if you want, and say all the other areas we're gonna be discussing on the basis of empirical evidence, be it prospective evidence or be it retrospective evidence, right? Evidence that we can simulate or evidence that we can document. And so once you've thrown out of the way the existential problems, which societies are perfectly legitimate to discuss without much evidence, we can be more empirical and use the court system for, the problems that only occur on very individual, micro, occasional instances, right? And be a little more anticipative when the problems become more systematic, more frequent, and more widespread. Like when you talk about technological unemployment, okay, it is certainly a very important concern, but it is not here yet. We have some time to discuss that, right? So, and this time is something that we should use as an asset. We should not sort of start to regulate the labor markets on the basis of a conjecture about AI in the future. We have some time to see how it comes. So economists are studying that, they are doing simulation and so on. So I think this will allow avoiding irrelevant law, being committed to take the time to watch empirical data. And yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think we have maybe a few more minutes for one final question. And there was a question, Nicolas, about something that was a little bit outside of the talk today, but nonetheless very important, and which is accountability. It's also one of the ethical principles that are being thrown around. And so there's always this question about, well, who are we going to hold accountable, or who's going to be responsible for a harm or an outcome? Any thoughts or ideas that you would like to share on that issue?
Yes, so that's true. That's a very important issue, especially because we live in an era in which us versus them, scapegoating and assigning responsibilities seems to be very important. So we're always looking for culprits when something arises. So the a problem of accountability okay, one thing that is very clear in my mind is that it's wrong to consider that AI manufacturers and developers do not demand accountability for themselves. So a lot of the developers and programmers and company people, engineers and others that I have met in the past years, they are often willing to engage in accountability, but they don't know how, okay? And so I think the question is not so much a question of the public opinion demands accountability, the AI developers refuse accountability. I think there's demands on all sides for accountability, but we have not found a process that would enable research organizations to operationalize their demands for accountability. We need to help them, show them a path, how you can account. And so very often I met students and they said, we often have questions when we were concerned, programming applications. We ask ourselves these questions and we don't know how to deal with them, how to voice them out, how to address them. And so I think here lawyers have to be clever. It's not this antagonistic accountability that we need to think about, whereas we need to impose accountability on the research organizations. But I think what we really want to do is to enable research organizations to discharge the accountability that they want to provide. And I think they really want to provide it. I mean, it's wrong to think that they're against that exercise.
Great. So I think we'll wrap up. And 시간이 다 되어 아쉽지만 마치려고 합니다. 수고해 주신 이니시티브의 스태프들에게 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. Nicolas, it was a privilege to have you speak today. Thank you again. I hope we will have the opportunity to have you speak in Seoul in person one day. And hopefully your mother will be able to make the trip together with you. 네, 오늘 참석해 주신 여러분들 모두 편안한 저녁 보내시길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.